the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828 is going to mark the beginning of what we're going to call Jacksonian democracy. Okay? First of all, it signifies this movement to include more people in a democratic process of elections. Andrew Jackson is elected in 1828 by and large because of the influence of Western states. The West had started lowering its property requirements for white men. So I know this seems like not liberal at all, but for democracy's history, to lower the voting requirements, to actually eliminate property requirements for white men, marks a milestone. White male suffrage, especially in the West, is going to be important to Jackson's election. Another reason why Jackson's election is significant is it really demonstrates how modern politics is evolving. So as I said, this particular election divides the Democratic Republicans. In the re-election campaign, Adams will call himself a national Republican. This will eventually turn into the Whigs. Jackson starts off calling himself a Democratic Republican, but eventually, to avoid confusion, drops the Republican part and just calls himself a Democrat. He's the first presidential candidate to be nominated by a political party as its frontrunner. This is the birth of the modern Democratic Party. So if you consider yourself a Democrat, you belong to the party that Andrew Jackson founded. Now, don't get too crazy about that looking back in the history and going, gosh, I don't support any of these things that Democrats of the 19th century supported. That's fine. Both the Democrats and Republicans have taken turns being conservative and liberal, right and wrong. But the history of the Democratic Party that exists today starts with the election of 1828. Another example of how this particular election became a milestone for modern elections is that it had all of the political drama and scandals surrounding what we're going to see here in 2020. Mudslinging, candidates calling one another out. Not that this was new. We saw with Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson that mudslinging existed. But really, the election of 1828 was about the character of the candidates and not their policies. John Quincy Adams was painted as this uncaring cold fish from Massachusetts. Jackson was painted as a hothead military general who was engaged in a bigamist relationship. This picture is Rachel Jackson, Andrew Jackson's wife. Jackson would claim that this election actually killed his wife. She died a month after the election wrapped up. She was the focus of another political smear campaign. People found out that she had been married before Jackson. That wasn't nothing new, but what the scandal was that her marriage to her first husband had not been properly ended. So she technically wasn't married to Jackson, or if she was married to two men, which is a crime called bigamy. So they carry this story out in the press, make her look like this sleazy, scandalous woman, which she wasn't. And by the end of the campaign, she's sick and tired and stressed, and she eventually dies from another illness. But Jackson will say that the campaign killed his wife. So political scandals become a part and parcel of modern political campaigns. We can see here, though, that the Democratic Republican Party unified behind Andrew Jackson. There isn't four candidates this time. Instead, there's just two, which means Jackson has support in the South and in the West. There's more voters able to vote in the West now because of white male suffrage. And so John Quincy Adams' domain remains up in New England and along the financial coast, and not much else. Jackson overwhelms John Quincy Adams over doubling his electoral votes, he becomes the first president of the West. That isn't to say that Jackson was born in the West. Okay, yes, he was from Tennessee, but he was born in South Carolina. People paint him as the common man, but really he was born a Southern aristocrat. He would be opposed to slavery, yet he personally owned over 200 slaves. Jackson's image was what people held up, not necessarily his actual reality. So Jackson tailors himself as this Westerner, frontiersman, American, and that really becomes the standard for the political profile of the next 60 years. Now, even though Jackson decried the corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay, he took that to another degree. In fact, the term spoils system is developed to describe how Jackson handles his cabinet. So you remember the fit that Andrew Jackson threw when John Quincy Adams named Henry Clay as his Secretary of State? Well, Jackson decides he's going to drain the swamp or clean the White House of its bureaucrats and place in there instead his neighbors and his friends. He says that every man is as good as the next. It's probably better if it's your neighbor. So in other words, there's really no merit to these bureaucratic jobs. Instead, you put someone in there that you can trust. You put someone in there that's going to toe your line, you'll be in good shape. This is Alexander Tocqueville, okay, or Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville was a Frenchman who was touring the United States in the 1830s, and he writes about his travels and what he witnesses. And eventually, his observations are published because what he witnesses has never been seen on the face of the earth before. Keep in mind, he's a Frenchman who has gone through and his country has experienced the French Revolution and then the return of despotism with Napoleon, right? They try to become democratic and they only end up with a military dictatorship. So Tocqueville goes through America and he romanticizes American society. He calls it a classless society. Not that classless as in they have no class, but literally this society has no separation really between rich and poor. Everybody in a community comes together at the local bar and they argue over politics. And then there's really no threshold, especially in the West, for people to be able to vote. There's no voting requirements for white men. And that their politicians go out and they actually campaign and beg people to elect them. And so the people have a tremendous amount of authority and responsibility in how their government runs. Now, Jack shared with us another quote by Tocqueville in his reflection that America will be this great Republican center until their elected officials discover that they can use the public good, the public money and trust, to basically bribe the public. So the American public isn't necessarily smart, but they're impassioned. They participate. And it's not just a small group in his mind, it's a much larger, never seen before size of group. Now, who's he forgetting? Who's he forgetting in this equation when he talks about how democratic America is and how representative it is? Who's being forgotten in his words? People of color, including Native Americans, slaves as well, women, right? And a lot of white men in states that still have property requirements. But to him, this is revolutionary. This is a lithograph of German American citizens going out to vote. No place in the world would someone who came from somewhere else be given the enfranchisement of voting and the protections of the Bill of Rights. This to him was revolutionary. And really, his writings are going to inspire and motivate people around the world throughout history to push for greater democracy. Is it romantic? Yes. Is it accurate? Not always. But it does reflect how unique America's character is becoming. If you're a math person, take a look at this graph. Okay, what we have here on this graph, a couple of things. First of all, like we just pointed out, most Americans were not eligible to vote. Of the whole population, only about 30% of Americans were able to vote in 1840. Okay, but of the 40% that could vote, nearly all of them did. 79% of eligible voters participated. Let's fast forward to 2008, when a much larger chunk of the population, because now we include people of color and women as eligible voters, the percentage of Americans that are 18 or older eligible to vote, only 59% of them voted in the 2009 elections. So we're not nearly as passionate about our enfranchisement, our right to vote, as they were in the 1840s. You know, we kind of take it for granted. And if this last election is proof of that, I think 2020 may be as well, because Democrats are having a really hard time finding a candidate that they feel inspired to get behind, especially those people that are on the fence and are like, well, if it's between this person and that person, I may not vote at all, which is really kind of sad. Women, you've voted for less than 100 years. It's absolutely important you exercise your right to vote. Okay, so now that we've talked about how Jackson brings about this new age of politics, let's look at the three major issues that were facing his presidency. Okay, number one, the tax, the tariff of abominations. Okay, the tariff, we've talked about how manufacturing had been protected behind a tariff. This was good for northern coastal states because their manufacturing couldn't compete with Europe's. But it was also becoming important to those people in the West because more factories are moving west. The goods that are being created in the north, things like steel plows, are going to be important to farmers in the West. And so there's this symbiotic relationship between the West and the North. The West wasn't as supportive of a very high tax, but they were supportive of a tax, where in the South, which is entirely dependent on Northern and European manufacturing, sees this not only as a bad deal, but an abomination. If you don't know what an abomination is, it's a sin against God. Okay? So as this tax goes up, it's really going to rile up the Southerners. Now, there's a little backstory here too. Okay, the South is already agitated because 8 years earlier, the whole topic of slavery reared its head with the Missouri Compromise. Right? We dealt with this last week. Missouri comes in as a slave state only through serious compromise. Henry Clay again, Missouri is a slave state, Maine's a free state, and slavery will only be protected south of Missouri's southern border. So it's a temporary win for the South, but long term, slavery may be threatened by limited space. That's reason number two. A third reason why the South is on edge is because there have been several prominent, notorious slave revolts. The slave revolt of Denmark-Vesey, where Vesey planned a a rebellion where he was going to take those that followed him south to Spanish Florida to meet up with the Cherokee and to basically engage in guerrilla warfare against those that would try to recapture them, shocked the nation. Now, ultimately, Vesey's plan failed, okay? And he and his followers were captured, re-enslaved, or killed. But the propaganda of Denmark Vesey's rebellion, planned rebellion, really shook the South to its core. We see an increase in fugitive slave laws. We see curfews. This is the point in history where a lot of southern states start passing laws to prevent slaves from reading, including the Bible, because the fear was that organization would lead to rebellion. So the South is this tinderbox of fear and hostility, and it's all channeled towards this tariff of abominations in 1828. And expressing the anger and angst of the South is this man, John C. Calhoun. If John C. Calhoun is mentioned in the news today, it's usually over one of his statues. Okay? There are lots of statues and roads and landmarks named or identified with John C. Calhoun. He is sometimes referred to as the founder of Southern secession movement. This guy was angry and fiery in his rhetoric, and it unites the South around this idea of retaliating against the Northern monopoly on federal power. Even though the North didn't have a monopoly, he resurrects the whole policy of nullification. Okay, what is nullification? Remind me what nullification is. We've seen this once before after the Alien and Sedition Acts. Remember, Jefferson and Madison had encouraged Kentucky and Virginia to nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts through the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. What does it mean to nullify?
To suppress.
Isn't that like approve?
Not to approve, but to invalidate. Okay, nullify means to invalidate. Now, this issue's been settled, folks. Here's something that's different in 1828 that didn't exist when the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were floating around. Marbury versus Madison has settled this. Marbury versus Madison gives what body the power to review a law and decide if it's constitutional or unconstitutional? The judicial branch. Future attorney. Nice job. Yeah. So John C. Calhoun is waking up this sleeping giant, saying that the states, because they came into the Union voluntarily, could nullify national laws if they were unconstitutional. This should have been a settled and done issue as far as the North is concerned. And he does this in a way that really pokes Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, who we know is a man to suffer no nonsense. So, John C. Calhoun leads this nullification crisis in the South. The Nullies are Southern legislators who support his theory that delegates ought to get together and nullify national law. He drafts up this contract in Charleston, South Carolina, that tells the national government it is nullifying the taxes and tariffs that are placed on goods coming into the South, and that if the national government doesn't abide by them, then South Carolina is going to secede. So the first mention of Southern secession comes out here in this nullification crisis. Andrew Jackson is a Westerner. He really doesn't give a damn about this tax. Okay? Yeah, the people support it. That's his mandate. And again, this points to what is changing in Jacksonian democracy. Remember, Jefferson thought that those that had land should lead the land. The Federalists, Washington and Adams, they thought the best of America should lead the country. Here we are in Jacksonian democracy, and we start hearing the president talk about how the people have mandated that there be a tariff, that the will of the people is the force of government. And so Jackson, not really caring about the tariffs, but caring about democracy and also caring about union, would not tolerate this nullification business. He gets so fired up that he issues out a letter that threatens to hang legislators who support nullification, and he seeks to get the military ready to go and march to the South. Compromise is needed, or civil war would start right here in 1828. Who's the great compromiser? Henry Clay. Here comes Henry Clay. The need for compromise would take each side away from the brink and settle this in 1833. Clay proposes the following. First of all, a plan to slowly reduce the tariff. You know what? Maybe the tariff is too high. We need to think about national interests, not just sectional interests. So a 10-year plan to slowly reduce the tariff, but at the same time to give Jackson the bite to match his bark. Part of the compromise tariff bill is going to be a force bill. The force bill is going to allow the president to call up the Army and Navy to enforce taxation if it comes to that. So, Congress will support the president in enforcement if the states don't comply. One last point here. John C. Calhoun in the South gets the point. They see the nation lining up against them. They can declare that they've won the battle because the tariff is going to be reduced. But they also don't want to admit they were wrong with nullification. So they nullify the nullification plan for the tariff, and then they also nullify the force bill. So that really is thumbing their nose at the president. By one last chance to nullify, they tell the president, we're nullifying your ability to use the military in the South. It's not legally solid, but it's a way of saying screw off. Okay? The real hero is Henry Clay, but Andrew Jackson is the commander-in-chief at this time, and so success is given credit to him. Tomorrow we'll talk about the Indian Removal Act and the Bank War.